Today, we encounter a parable about two men who have very different experiences in life and in death. It reminds us that when Jesus says that he's good news for the poor, that Jesus indeed might also be seen as bad news for the wealthy. I think this may be one of the most alarming of Jesus' parables regarding the poor. Not alarming for the poor, but rather for us, for those of us who live in comfort, those of us who have plenty. It's not a difficult parable to understand, but perhaps it's a difficult one to hear, and maybe even a harder one to accept. It's a classic reversal of fortune story involving two men, a rich man and a poor man. The rich man is not given a name, which is typical in Jesus' parables. That usually is the case. But in this parable, we have an exception to the rule. The poor man, he gets a name in this parable, and the name Jesus gives him is Lazarus. Now, Lazarus in ancient times, in Greek culture, would mean to people, God will help. That's what the name means. God will help. And indeed, it is Lazarus, the poor man, who God helps in this parable. Now, there is no real person named Lazarus. It's not Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, because this is a parable. Right? Remember, that's a fictitious story told by Jesus to teach an important lesson. The lesson begins with our introduction to this man, Lazarus, and to the rich man, and how they represent two worlds in close proximity to one another, but yet two very separate, very different worlds. The rich man is dressed in purple, fine clothing. The poor man is dressed in oozing sores. The rich man sits inside in comfort. The poor man sits outside on the ground. The rich man feasts, while the poor man longs to satisfy his hunger with anything that falls from the table, anything that gets thrown out in the trash. The rich man, the man of privilege, he does most of the talking in this parable, and he consistently demonstrates his privilege in doing so. Demonstrates that he's accustomed to the privilege of openly voicing his concerns. While Lazarus, the poor man, the man without privilege, the man without power, he never speaks a word in this parable. In this parable, Lazarus is silent. There's no indication that the rich man is evil. There's no indication of the level of faith of either man. All we know about them is that one has all his needs met and the other has none of his needs met. The parable goes on to tell us that both men die. No indication why. But soon after they die, their roles are immediately reversed. The poor man, lacking money for a proper burial, is taken up by the angels and carried to Abraham's side. Now, Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish people, and so in this parable, as told by Jesus, Abraham serves as the keeper of heaven. The rich man can afford a proper burial, yet he ends up in a place of fire and unending torture, as opposed to being at Abraham's side. The one who was afflicted is now comforted. The one who lived comfortably is now in agony. The first has become last, and the last is now first. Lazarus in death enjoys time in the arms of Abraham, nestled like a child in the bosom of Abraham, safe, warm, and content. The rich man is now in anguish. He's being tormented. He's left to gaze with envy at both Abraham and Lazarus, who he can see far off in the distance. On earth, the two men were physically close, but still lived in very different worlds. Now, the physical proximity is replaced by a great divide between the two men, one in paradise, the other in torment. Their roles are truly reversed. Sadly, the rich man, after all this, is none the wiser, even after this death experience. Even after death, he still maintains an attitude of a man of privilege. And so he openly pleads his case. He takes his case to Abraham. He asks Abraham, says, hey, send Lazarus to me to dip his finger in the water to cool my tongue. The rich man still sees Lazarus as someone who is lowly, someone he can still treat as a servant. Even as Lazarus now stands next to Abraham in heaven. Abraham responds with compassion to the rich man, calling him child. With sadness, Abraham explains the great divide that lies between them and that it's too late for the rich man. In the parable, Abraham takes no delight in this terrible situation. Finally, as it dawns on the rich man that he's going to be stuck with this horrible fate, we see a little hint of compassion from him. He thinks of others just a little. After hearing Abraham's explanation that there was essentially no hope for him, he begs Abraham on behalf of his brothers. But even now, his compassion is limited to his own family, and he continues to treat Lazarus as his servant. The rich man says to Abraham, hey, send Lazarus. Send him to my family home. I want him to explain to my 5 brothers so they don't end up like me. We assume his 5 brothers are also rich. Doesn't say. But Abraham refuses. He says, hey, just like you and your brothers, you were already warned. You were sufficiently warned by Moses and by a long series of prophets, all who told you that there are not supposed to be anyone as poor and as desperate as Lazarus. Not according to the law of Moses, not according to God's will, not according to the law of love. No. People are supposed to take care of their neighbors in need. The rich man and his brothers were citizens of Israel, and as such, they had received that information time and again. They had received all the warning they needed from Moses and the prophets. But the rich man, he's not going to accept. He refuses Abraham's conclusion. Despite everything that happened, he's still assuming an air of privilege. This is a man who's used to getting his way. So the rich man says, no, Abraham, no. It's not fair. My brothers cannot be expected to listen to Moses and the prophets, but let me tell you, surely they'll listen to Lazarus, the poor man, if he comes back from the dead with this message about the rich and the poor. Surely they'll be, come on, Abraham, wake up. Abraham is not convinced. Abraham has no intention to send Lazarus off to do the rich man's bidding. So the poor man stays in heaven, and the rich man does not. And that's the end of the parable. What do you think? Hard message? Yeah. What do you think? Do you think if Abraham sent a beggar back from the dead, a person that the rich folks and his brothers had ignored in life, do you think they would listen to him and mend their ways after death? Really? Do you think they'd start treating poor people better if that happened? Abraham says no. I don't think so. Unlike many of Jesus' other parables, this is not a parable that needs a lot of explanation. It's pretty blunt. There's a man who was poor and had suffered during his life on earth, and he was given comfort in the hereafter. Nearby, there's another man who had every comfort in this lifetime, and he was left to spend the rest of eternity in torment. Notice the specific beliefs, the faithfulness of the rich man or of Lazarus are never mentioned by Jesus. Jesus only mentions their wealth. The only information we're given is that these two men had lived near each other and that one suffered greatly and had nothing in this life, and the other was rich and well-fed. And we learn from Abraham that the rich man would have listened. If the rich man would have listened to Moses and the prophets, he would not be in this situation. So that's what Abraham says. If they would have listened. To listen to what? What did Moses and the prophets say that would have saved this rich man from torment? Jesus doesn't spell it out in this particular parable. But based on our knowledge of other teachings, based on our understanding of the Old Testament, maybe we can make some assumptions about what this might have been. I mean, at the most basic level, the rich man demonstrated a failure to love one's neighbor, specifically Lazarus, as commanded by Moses and all the prophets. The most basic level. We are all God's children. Now just imagine, how would God view a situation where a few children hoard great wealth while God's other children go without to the point of starvation and illness? How does that look to God? And there are quite a few teachings, by the way, from the prophets that support the lesson of this parable. This parable doesn't stand alone. Right? The lesson that our love for neighbor can be measured by our treatment of the poor and the rejected. For example, Isaiah 58:10 says that if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, your light will go forth in the darkness and your night will be like noonday. Deuteronomy 15 says, there should be no poor people among you. If the rich man and his brothers had lived and conducted business based on Moses' teachings, there would not have been someone starving and begging for food at their gate, covered in sores. But what about us? How does this apply to us? What about today? Today's world. The fact that there are still poor people is an indication that we're not doing a very good job of following the law of Moses either. There are so many biblical laws that were intended to prevent poverty. Over the centuries, those are the ones that have been mostly ignored. Maybe that's why the issue of poverty was at the core of Jesus' earthly mission. Right? We heard about, right from the start, we heard about Christ's calling, his calling from his mother. You remember Mary's song before his birth? Mary rejoiced. Listen, this is what Mary said before Jesus was born. She said, he has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. That's what Mary said. Jesus certainly sends the rich away empty in today's parable. You remember when Jesus said, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Remember that? Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. These teachings seem to directly reflect today's parable, reminding us that this parable actually fits quite nicely in the wider message of the Bible, with the law of Moses, with the teachings of the prophet, and the example of Jesus Christ himself. When Jesus started his ministry, he repeated the words of Isaiah. He said, I am good news for the poor. And Jesus will, in a few chapters ahead in the Gospel of Luke, teach that it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Those are pretty strong warnings against any sort of systemic poverty. And yet there are so many poor. They come to our door almost every day, or they call us looking, hoping for help. As a people, our addiction to wealth, to power, and to privilege continue today, maybe even more so than in Jesus' time. We have veered so far from the teachings of Jesus in terms of dealing with poverty that it's not even close to being a priority for most people. It's not a popular concept either, outside or inside of most churches. But the Bible, in pretty stark terms, tells us that the poor matter to God. And that if we love our neighbor, the poor matter to us as well. If we need another sign, if we need a spectacle, something from heaven to show us, to prove to us that we must consider maybe that there is no sign big enough. There's nothing spectacular enough to convince us, at least not at our current level of spiritual maturity. And that's the final message of this parable. The final message being that justice for the poor is sacred. Well, I should say that's the first message. Okay. The first message is that justice for the poor is sacred and a potentially devastating measurement of our relationship with God. That's the first message. That's the message we get when we see Lazarus at Abraham's side. Then as the rich man begs, commands, and requests things from Abraham, we're reminded of how much we are set in our ways, and we're not easily convinced. Such that even sending a dead person back from the grave will not convince us, will not change our minds. What will it take for us to listen to God and to act accordingly? To deal with poverty and other social justice issues? We've already received the witness of countless prophets throughout all ages, all bringing a similar message about poverty, and we have the teachings and the example as offered by Jesus himself. What more do we need? Like the rich man and his brothers in this parable, will we continue to ask for bolder and bolder signs? Treatment of the poor is possibly the greatest thing that we ignore in the Bible. And we've traditionally ignored it. I'm blaming you guys. I mean, there's a long history of ignoring this stuff. I mean, Martin Luther, right, the great reformer back in the 16th century, he explained this parable away, teaching that the heaven and hell aspects of this parable were certainly not to be taken literally. What Martin Luther said, something like that the heaven and hell in this parable were actually symbolic of our conscience. This is how our conscience will burn and torment us if we don't help the poor. It's not a very convincing argument, frankly, particularly when given the rest of the biblical record. But, any excuse not to avoid helping the poor will do, traditionally, for a really long time, not just now. Now, other folks have found other ways to set this message aside, that this story is just about that one rich man, that one poor man. It's not a parable, doesn't apply to rich and poor people in general. That's another way it's been set aside. Few among the well-fed and well-heeled like the thought of heaven and hell being determined by our treatment of the poor. Most of traditional Christianity puts far more emphasis on what we believe rather than how we treat the poor. And I'm not suggesting that we upend all of Christianity for this parable. But at the same time, I don't want us to be overly confident that just having or expressing our belief in God is the only thing that's important either. I think most of us know that our faith is more complicated than simple belief, particularly those of us that are more spiritually mature. It's likely that questions regarding eternity are far more complex than this. based on my personal experience, our faith changes us in ways that make hoarding wealth difficult, if not impossible. If we're doing the ministry of Jesus Christ, if we are faithful followers of Jesus, then our ministry will be good news for the poor. If it's not, we need to reevaluate. To an impoverished people, to the poor, this parable offers great comfort. This parable is good news for the poor. To most of us, however, steeped in a consumer society, often on the wrong side of the chasm, of the void, this parable is one of the hardest to hear, if we can hear it at all. And things are complicated, right? How rich do you have? I mean, I don't want to get into that. But as we continue to pray, I hope that we continue to pray, to have ears to hear the teaching of Jesus and the prophets, that we have eyes to see the suffering at our gates, even if it's hidden from us, even if there are those who don't want us to see, and that we have hearts and hands for the afflicted, which this church has shown time and again to have, as we hope to be comforted at the end of our journey too. Amen.